we need to talk about feeling lonely even when you're around other people. Because sometimes the hardest type of loneliness isn't the kind you feel when you're physically alone. It's when you're with people but feel like nobody really sees you or understands what's going on beneath the surface. And that can take a real toll on your mental health. So in this episode, I'm talking about why it happens and how to create real connections with people to overcome loneliness. So let's talk about feeling lonely when you're not alone. Hello, I'm Jeremy Godwin, and this is the Let's Talk About Mental Health podcast, full of practical advice for better mental health. Today I'm talking about loneliness, and it can be a really strange thing because a lot of us tend to assume that it only counts when we're physically alone and by ourselves. But that's not actually how it works. You can have people in your life, people you see regularly, people you talk to, work with, live with, even love, and still feel deeply disconnected, like something is missing, like you're there but not really being seen. You know, like you're included but not truly known. And when that happens, it can be hard not to turn that feeling against yourself. You might start thinking things like, what's wrong with me? Or why do I feel like this even when I've got people around me? But often the issue is not that you're damaged or that you're asking for too much. It's that there's a big difference between having people around you versus having connection that feels safe, honest, mutual, and most importantly, emotionally real. So in this episode, we're going to explore what this kind of loneliness actually is, why it happens, and what you can do to start creating relationships that feel more genuine and more nourishing. Now, before we go any further, the first practical thing I want you to do is to stop asking yourself questions like, why am I like this? And start instead asking, what is this loneliness trying to tell me? Because that shifts you out of self-attack and into self-awareness. Instead of treating the feeling like it's proof that there's something wrong with you, you begin to treat it as information. Maybe it means you're craving more honesty in your relationships. Maybe you don't feel safe with the people around you. Maybe you've been surrounded by contact but starved of real connection. Naming whatever it is helps you to reduce shame, and it also gives you somewhere real to begin. Feeling lonely around other people is information, not failure. So we're going to build on that idea throughout today's episode. First, let's get ourselves on the same page and let's talk about what is feeling lonely around others. So feeling lonely around other people is the experience of being in contact with others without feeling genuinely connected to them. In other words, it means that you can have people around you and still feel emotionally alone. You might be talking, socializing, replying to messages, showing up at work or spending time with friends, or even sitting right beside someone that you care about, and yet it can still feel like there's a gap. Like you're present, but you're not really known. Or like there's company, but not closeness. And that type of feeling can be really confusing, because on paper, it may look like you're not alone at all. You might have a great social life, people who care about you. You might even be constantly around others and rarely ever get a moment to yourself. But if those relationships are more one-sided, or more surface level, or if you don't feel emotionally safe, or maybe if you feel like you have to hide parts of yourself in order to keep the peace or to fit in, then loneliness can still show up. In fact, sometimes that kind of loneliness cuts even deeper because it can make you feel unseen in the middle of supposedly being seen. What a lot of people tend to misunderstand about loneliness is that they treat it like it's a numbers problem, right? We assume that if you have enough people around you, you shouldn't feel lonely, but it doesn't work like that. Loneliness is not just about proximity, it's about actual connection, right? Like, it's not like when we were 5 where you could just play in the playground or the sandpit and see that somebody else had a Matchbox car and you've got a Matchbox car, and there you go, you're best friends. Things are different. As you grow, as you move into adolescence, as you become an adult, that's when we start craving deeper quality connections. We need to understand that it's about whether or not you feel understood or supported or accepted, and whether or not you're able to be your true self around other people. So no, this is not about needing more people around you. You could go and get 300 new people in your life, and I guarantee you that unless you focus on the connection piece, it's not going to make a bit of difference. What you need is more truth, more safety, more depth to your relationships, more connection, and a lot more mutual benefit and respect in the relationships that you already have. Feeling alone, feeling lonely absolutely sucks. It's like that Celine Dion song from back in the 90s. Don't want to be all by myself anymore. And yes, I know it's a cover version, so don't come at me. I had to quote Celine's version though, because, it's got way more drama in it. I had someone a few years back who I used to work with, and we got on really, really well. And so much so that we stayed in touch after I left the company. But over time, I began to realize that the whole friendship was becoming more and more one-sided as time went by. And then the last time that I went to visit her and catch up, we spent nearly 45 minutes talking, and she did not ask me a single question about my life that entire time. Not one. And so that was the day that I decided enough was enough. Because a healthy relationship of any kind needs to be mutually respectful, mutually supportive, and mutually beneficial. Now, when we're talking about loneliness, we do need to acknowledge that sometimes there's also another layer to it, which is that you may have learned over time to protect yourself by staying guarded, or by performing or people-pleasing, or only showing the most acceptable parts of who you are to others. And so even when connection is possible, there's also the consideration that you may not fully let yourself step into it. This is not going to be the case for everybody, but it certainly is for a lot of people, and I know it has been and still is for me, right? This is not because you're doing anything wrong, but because you are trying to stay safe, which is completely understandable. But safe can start to really affect your mental health in a deeper way. So with that in mind, now let's explore why this stuff happens and why it matters so much. And let's talk about why loneliness affects your mental health. And I will just point out here quickly that I did a general episode on loneliness all the way back in episode 15 at the beginning of 2020, when it was just me and a cheap microphone. I mean, it's still just me, but now I've got an expensive microphone. Anyway, this episode is much more focused on that lonely but not alone feeling. And really, it can take a much bigger toll on your mental health than most people realize, because we human beings are hardwired for connection, but not just any kind of connection. We need to feel safe. We need to feel understood. We need to feel seen. And we need to feel like we can actually be ourselves with at least some of the people in our lives, without judgment. So when you're around others but still feel emotionally alone, it can create a really unsettling kind of internal tension. So on one level, you're with people, right? But on another level, you still feel disconnected and unseen, or like you're carrying everything by yourself. And that disconnect can slowly wear you down. It chips away at your sense of belonging. And when you don't feel like you truly belong, it becomes so much easier to slip into self-doubt, sadness, anxiety, resentment, emotional numbness, or that flat and heavy feeling of, what's the point? You might start second-guessing yourself. You may feel guilty for feeling lonely when you supposedly shouldn't. You may tell yourself that you're too much, too sensitive, too needy, or just too awful at relationships. But here's the blunt truth. Being surrounded by people does not automatically mean that your emotional needs are being met. It just means you're around people. And pretending otherwise will just keep you stuck. It's not about quantity. It's about quality when it comes to relationships. Now, a big part of why this happens is that we often confuse contact with connection. Contact is not connection. We think that if we're interacting with people, then that should be enough. But it's not. I mean, I know that's the entire business model of social media, but it's not enough. If the connection doesn't feel safe or mutual or honest or real. And so that's the message here. Loneliness is not always about having nobody around you. Sometimes it's about not being able to be real in the relationships that you do have. Sometimes that happens because we end up stuck in particular roles. The helper, the easygoing one, the strong one, the one who keeps the peace, the one who listens but never says what's really going on with them. And if people only know that version of you that performs or copes or stays convenient, then of course connection is going to feel limited. This is also where there's a lot of potential for causing yourself emotional harm. The more disconnected you feel, the more likely you might be to protect yourself by pulling back emotionally, or keeping things surface level, or masking, or waiting for someone else to magically notice that you're not okay. But the more you protect yourself in those ways, the harder it becomes for real connection to happen. So that's when you end up in this incredibly painful cycle where loneliness makes you hide, and then hiding makes you even lonelier. I know because I've been in that cycle. That's one of the main reasons why I wanted to cover this topic now, because a lot of us are not actually lacking contact, we're lacking depth, emotional safety, and the ability to be fully ourselves. And here's the thing. If that goes unrecognized for too long, it can leave you feeling deeply disconnected, not just from other people, but from yourself as well. And so we're going to talk about how to work on that right after this quick break. And welcome back. Now it's time to get into the how-to part of this episode. So let's talk about how to deal with loneliness. All right, we're going to talk through practical advice specifically focused on how to overcome loneliness even when you're around others. Like I said earlier, I covered loneliness as a general topic back in episode 15, and it is linked in the episode description. For today's one, as always, you're going to find all of these points in the transcript, which is also linked in the description, as well as being on my website at ltamh.com/episodes. So you don't need to try and memorize everything that I'm saying, unless you're off to a really weird quiz night where all of the questions happen to be about loneliness. Okay, so to be clear up front, the way to work on this issue is not to just throw more people at the problem and hope you connect with some of them. I think I've made that point pretty clear throughout today's episode. The point here is to become more honest with yourself about what's feeding the loneliness, what kind of connection is missing, and then what needs to change in the way that you relate to others and to yourself. And so that's what we're going to focus on. And so with all of that in mind, my first tip is stop treating your loneliness like a character flaw. Because it's not. And it's also not evidence that you're broken or difficult or somehow bad at being a person. It is information. It's telling you that something about your current experience of connection is not meeting a real emotional need. So, start there. Instead of just saying, I feel lonely, ask yourself, what exactly is missing here? Think about it, really think about it, and name it. Is it honesty? Is it depth? Is it emotional safety? Is it a lack of mutual benefit? Is it the ability to be yourself without feeling judged or ignored or minimized or managed or misunderstood? Because the more specific you can be with yourself, the easier it then becomes to respond to the real issue instead of just sitting in the feeling when feeling hopeless. Okay, next, pay attention to what actually happens in your interactions. You know that story I told you earlier about the one-sided friendship I was in? It wasn't until that specific interaction that I realized just how one-sided things had become. And unfortunately, not all connection is nourishing. Some interactions leave you feeling calmer, more open, and more like yourself, which is great. But others leave you feeling flat, awkward, drained, unseen, or somehow even lonelier than before. Recognizing all of that matters. So, be honest with yourself about which relationships in your life feel genuinely mutual and which ones feel performative or one-sided. Which ones make space for the real you and which ones only really work when you play a particular role. Because if you keep investing most of your energy into relationships that only work when you shrink yourself, you're going to keep getting the same emotional outcome. Nothing changes if nothing changes. So it's up to you to identify where things need to change in your relationships. Next, look at the role self-protection may be playing. A lot of people who feel lonely around others aren't just dealing with disappointing relationships, they're also dealing with old habits that made emotional survival possible. Maybe you learned to be easy, or useful, or cheerful, or low maintenance, or emotionally private. Maybe being fully yourself in the past didn't always feel safe or wasn't always possible. And so, of course, you've learned to edit over time. Of course, you learned to stay guarded. But that's not a failure. However, if those patterns are still running the show now, then they may be keeping you disconnected from the very thing that you want. So part of the work here is about genuinely and gently noticing where you're still hiding and asking whether that protection is helping you or isolating you. And yes, I know firsthand that the idea of letting your guard down can be terrifying, but walls keep people out. This stuff can be really complicated and deep-seated. So there is stuff that you can do on your own, but it's also, the more deep-seated it is, it's not necessarily a DIY job. So if you need to, then please work with a therapist or counselor to work through your stuff so that you can begin to then go through it, work through it, open yourself up to others slowly and safely, and with support. Next, start prioritizing connection over contact. In other words, stop feeding into the idea that having more contact automatically means more connection, because that's not how this works. That's why we so often feel so lonely on social media, because it's like the junk food of connection. Cheap, full of filler, and likely to leave you hungry for more half an hour later. Look, you can fill your week with messages and plans and noise and company, and yet still feel profoundly alone if none of it feels real. So instead of asking, how do I spend more time with people? Try asking yourself, where do I feel safest being more real? That might be with one person, not 10. It might be having a quieter conversation one-on-one rather than in a group setting. It might be a relationship that has potential for more honesty if you stop defaulting to "I'm fine" whenever they ask you how you're doing. Real connection usually grows through truth and vulnerability, not just proximity and performance. Next, take a small emotional risk with someone safe. And to be clear, I'm talking about just one someone here. I'm not asking you to do it with everyone you know, or to stop people in the street, or to do some sort of dramatic, oversharing, emotional karaoke sort of thing. Just one small step with one person that you feel safe with. Say a little more of what's actually true to you to someone that you trust. Admit that you've been feeling a bit disconnected. Share something real instead of automatically keeping it light. Let someone see a little bit more of you, of your truth, of what's going on underneath the polished version that you present to the world. Because if nobody ever sees the real you, then even love and care can feel strangely hollow. People may respond to you, but they can't fully connect with you unless you let them. Okay, next, focus on quality over quantity. This is one of the many areas in life where more is not automatically better. Having one relationship where you feel genuinely known is worth way more than a whole crowd of people who only know you on the surface. So build slowly and intentionally. Put more energy into the people who feel steady, curious, respectful, and, most importantly, emotionally available. And at the same time, put less energy into dynamics that leave you feeling invisible, unseen, dismissed, or lonely in their company. And above all, protect your peace by being honest with yourself about the difference. Next, strengthen your relationship with yourself. Because loneliness isn't only about other people. Sometimes when you feel disconnected from your own needs and your own truth and your own emotional reality, everything around you starts to feel a bit hollow as well, and everything within you. So regularly make space to check in with yourself properly. What do you need more of? What are you tolerating? What are you pretending not to notice? What part of you wants more honesty here? Now, you don't need to solve all of this stuff in one go, but you do need to be honest enough to identify it so that you can then begin to find solutions and slowly figure out a healthier way forward and take the steps towards that. Investing in your self-awareness will always pay dividends. And besides, your relationship with yourself is the longest one you're ever going to have, so you may as well try to make it a good one. So here's what I want you to take away from this episode. If you feel lonely, even when you're around other people, that doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. Often what it really means is that something about your experience of connection is missing or blocked or not emotionally real enough to meet you where you are and to meet your needs. And so once you start being honest about that, that's when you can begin to change it. So here's a question I want you to reflect on. Where in your life do you feel surrounded by people but not truly connected? And what needs to change? Because when you boil it all down, loneliness is often about not feeling seen or safe or able to be real in the relationships you have. Each week I like to finish up by sharing a quote about the topic, and I encourage you to take a few moments to really reflect on it and consider what it means to you. This week's quote is by an unknown author, and it is, "Being alone beats sitting next to someone and feeling lonely." Let me repeat that. Being alone beats sitting next to someone and feeling lonely. All right, that's it for this week. For more straightforward tips, grab a copy of my book, Life Advice That Doesn't Suck. It's linked in the description. And if you'd like to support my work, you can find out more about my Patreon at ltamh.com. It's also linked below. Thank you very much for joining me today. Look after yourself and make a conscious effort to share positivity and kindness out into the world, because you get back what you put out. Take care and talk to you next time. Join me next week when I talk about dealing with manipulative behavior. And check out my episode on navigating challenging relationships next. It's linked in the description. I release new episodes every Sunday, so follow or subscribe to never miss an episode. Let's Talk About Mental Health is an independent program. Discover more at ltamh.com.